Hi, this is Mr. Thomas. In this video, I'd like to give you a brief overview of Chapter 1, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. One of the things that will help you learn and be successful in this chapter is to understand the vocabulary, really in every chapter, but this first chapter has a lot of vocabulary terms, so early on, find a way to study the vocabulary. One of the best ways to do this is to make flashcards for the terms or make a vocabulary journal or a special section of your notebook that's just dedicated to vocabulary terms. So for example, here we have two words that are central to the chapter, but through the entire course, anatomy and physiology. They are two separate things. Anatomy, you can see here, is a study of the body structure. So we'll be covering in the course anatomical information, the body structure, the organs, the tissues, the cells. Physiology is all about function, is how that particular tissue or cell or organ functions throughout the body. Now, just some basic background information for living organisms. Now, that's what this chapter is. It's just an overview of some basic information that you'll see here, not only in this chapter, but we'll carry it through the entirety of the course. So some basic characteristics of living things is, one, that living things are made up of cells. Cells, the basic unit of life. And you see some ways to kind of think about a cell here. It's the smallest unit that can carry out functions of life. We have another chapter that's going to go into basically cell biology, and that'll cover like what is a cell, what's inside the cell. The nucleus will go through different parts of the cell, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the ribosomes. You may have heard of many of those. So we'll cover that in another chapter. But for now, all living organisms, including the human body, are composed of cells. All living organisms, number two, have some type of metabolism. Metabolism, and we'll eventually get to another chapter that covers more on metabolism, but just a basic definition for metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that take place inside of the body. That's metabolism. And so metabolism can either be used to make something in the body. Let's say you're trying to make a particular protein in the body for the muscles, or you're making some type of carbohydrate or a sugar. And so you can build something up, or you can actually break something down. And usually if you're breaking something down, that's usually to get energy from. And so metabolic processes can do either of those. Number three is growth. All living organisms grow. And so in this case, we mean they grow in size. They grow in the size of the individual cells, but they also increase in number. And so there's two main processes that we'll eventually talk about later in the semester called mitosis and meiosis, cell division, where you increase the number of cells. You have cells that form new cells. And so that's part of growth. Then 4 and 5 are listed here on this slide. Excretion, living organisms, because living organisms do have all these chemical reactions taking place, that's the metabolism, they're going to produce some waste products, some byproducts. Most of those byproducts are going to be toxic to the body, so they have to have some way to eliminate those waste products, and that's called excretion. This characteristic, number 5, responsiveness. Sometimes it's called irritability. That just means that the organism has the ability to react to some kind of stimulus in the environment. Right? It responds, the organism, the humans, we respond to changes in the environment. If it gets too cold, we respond. If it gets too hot, we respond. If it gets too cold, we will respond by shivering. If it gets too hot, we respond by sweating, trying to cool our bodies off. So we can detect and then we react to changes in the environment. That's how we can respond to different stimuli in the environment. And then movement. It's another characteristic of living organisms. There's different types of movements in the body. You could be talking about movement of the entire organism. As we are mobile, we're moving around, we're moving our muscles and our bones, our skeletal system. You could be talking about the movement of individual cells, or you could be referring to the movement of materials in and out of a cell. It's all three of these are examples of movement which is a characteristic of a living organism. Reproduction, that's another good characteristic here. Again, you can be talking about, for reproduction, individual cells, and that goes back to mitosis or cell division. Individual cells have the ability to reproduce, and that's part of growth, but that's also part of replacing maybe some damaged cells or some broken down cells. And then, of course, the organism itself reproduces to give another offspring. All right, and the next little topic, we'll talk about levels of structural and functional organizations. This is basically just what's called a hierarchy of how the human body is organized. And so if you think about it, the largest of the hierarchy is the organism. And so we're going to work our way up to this. And so if we go back down to the smallest, you'll see that the smallest level of structural organization really is the chemical level. And so we have chemicals in our body, and we're going to talk about those in another chapter, mainly these biochemicals, such as carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, and nucleic acids, and we'll kind of discuss about those special types of organic chemicals. You also have inorganic chemicals like water, and you have gases that are in the body. So you have many different chemicals that are part of that metabolism that we mentioned before. Then all of that then becomes a cell. And so you have a cell, remember, is the smallest part of the living organism that is truly alive, a living cell. Cells then working together create what's called a tissue. And so when you have cells, common cells in an area, you have create a tissue, and there's 4 major types of tissue in the body. We'll look at this again a little bit later on. 4 major types of tissue. That's endothelial tissue or epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And so we're going to talk about all 4 of those types in a different chapter. Once you have tissues, and those tissues are found in a certain location, and they're all kind of working together for the same function, then you have what's called an organ, such as the kidneys, or the liver, or the brain, or whatever organ you want to talk about. Put those organs that have a similar function together, and that creates an organ system. So similar organs that go together. So for example, if you're talking about the digestive system, you would have the stomach, and the liver is part of that, and the esophagus is part of that, and the intestines are part of that. Yeah, I'm trying to name the different organs that are part of each system. So, the intestines, the small and large intestines will be part of the digestive system. So all of the different organs that make up that particular system would be the organ system. And then when you put all the different systems together, most books outline 11 different body systems. You put all 11 different body systems together, and you have the organism. All right, let's look at some more vocabulary words here. Types of anatomy. In many cases, you'll be studying some type of gross anatomy, which is also called macroscopic. Notice the prefix here, macro. This is large or viewable, looking at it without a microscope, just with the naked eye, gross anatomy. And so, for example, one of the things that we'll do in lab is look at the gross anatomy of the skeletal system. And so you'll be naming the bones and the different parts of the bones. We'll be naming the muscles, and so you're going to have opportunities to study the macroscopic portion of the anatomy. There's different ways that can be done. You can study in a regional format, and we'll do this a little bit. So for example, when we look at the skeletal system, one of the ways we'll study regionally is by looking at what's called the appendicular system of the skeletal system. And that's, in other words, looking at the appendages, looking at the arms and the legs. And then we'll look at the axial, which includes the skull and the vertebral column. So that's a regional area by area. A lot of the information that we'll cover here will really be systemic. In other words, you're studying the body in a system by system format. So once we go through some of the introductory chapters, we're eventually going to start with a system. We'll start with the integumentary system, and then we'll move into the skeletal system. We'll move into the muscular system, then we'll move into the nervous system. So we'll go system by system to study the different systems of the body. Then you can also look at the external form of the surface anatomy. What can you see on the skin? What can you see on the surface? And so you can also do some of that as well. In lab, we'll look at some microscopic anatomy, structures seen with a microscope. And so this really comes in two forms, looking at cells. And again, we'll have a chapter that deals with cells. And so we're looking at, what does a particular cell look like? What's inside the cell? And then a lot of times we'll look at the tissue. So the study of looking at cells is called cytology. If you don't know this prefix, this is another good one, CYT. If the word begins with cyte or it ends with cyte, it's referring to a cell. And then histo is referring to tissues. So histology is the study of tissues, and this would be, again, using microscopes. The textbook has a nice picture. Be sure to go through the different figures and pictures in the textbook, and that'll help you understand some of the topics here. So here you have the different levels of organization down to the chemical level, and then all the way up to the organism. Then we'll very briefly go over this next set of slides. This is begins with figure 1.5. They basically cover the 11 organ systems of the human body. You don't need to know every single thing about these. This is just kind of giving you an introduction to the 11 systems. And then that's our goal in this class, is to begin with 4 of the major systems. Integumentary is here, so that's basically your hair, skin, and nails. You can kind of see that and some of the functions. The skeletal system will also cover in this unit. That includes all of the 206 bones of the body and the joints and what it's made out of, the cartilage that you find. The skeletal system, muscular system, and we'll talk about the function of the muscles and also the gross anatomy or the macroscopic anatomy of the muscles as well. And then we'll conclude 168 with talking about the nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. In 169, you'll begin with the endocrine system and talk about various glands and all of the hormones and chemicals that are produced by those glands. You'll cover the cardiovascular system. That includes the heart, the blood vessels, blood flowing through the body. We'll talk about the lymphatic system, system that helps to return extra fluid back to the cardiovascular system, from the tissues back to the cardiovascular system, but also helps in your immune system. And so you can see some of the main features of the lymphatic system, all of the lymph vessels. Those are the vessels outlined in green here. And you have some lymphatic organs, including the tonsils, your lymph nodes, your thymus, the spleen, and kind of see all of the different vessels scattered throughout. We'll also, in 169, cover the respiratory system. You kind of see some of the major structures there. The nasal cavity is where that system begins. The pharynx, the larynx or the voice box, the trachea or the windpipe, and of course the lungs. The digestive system, lots of different structures here. And so again, that will be covered in 169. The urinary system, the kidneys, the ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. The prostate gland, here we have the reproductive system for male and female, and they've separated that out into 2 separate slides here. So for male reproductive system, you can see some of the main functions: produces, transports sperm cells, secretes hormones, and of course is involved in sexual function. You see some of the major organs here: the prostate gland, the testes, and the penis is part of that system. For the female reproductive system, this will be the last unit that's covered in 169 usually. And you see for the female, it's producing, transporting the egg cells, and it's a site for fetal development, secretes hormones, sexual functions, all of that, and kind of see some of the major structural anatomy for the female reproductive system. All right, the last major topic I wanted to cover in this brief overview of the chapter comes from section 1.5, and it talks about several main core principles in anatomy and physiology. So these are just general principles. However, they are core to the study, which means that you're going to see them not only in this chapter, but you'll see them in future chapters as we go through. For example, homeostasis. A good way to summarize homeostasis is balance or equilibrium. Your body has a natural way to try to keep many different aspects of its function, many different aspects of its physiology in equilibrium or balance. And so we're going to talk about several examples as we go through. First of all is feedback loops. So let me show you this graph. I got this from a different textbook. It basically shows an example of how homeostasis would work in the body. So in general, what you would have is some type of set point. So for example, let's look at body temperature as our variable. Right? Think about what the normal body temperature of the body should be. Usually, and everybody's a little different, usually the normal body temperature, is about 98.6 degrees. And that's Fahrenheit. 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. That's a normal range. Notice that it fluctuates. So if you check your body temperature throughout the day, it may fluctuate a little bit, maybe not much, but it may fluctuate a little bit. And so you have a set point of where it should be. So again, for example, for body temperature, the hypothalamus sets that, just like a thermostat, you have an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it sets that temperature. Just like a thermostat would, it's set at 98.6 degrees. And then throughout the day or maybe throughout the week, it may fluctuate a little bit, and it may go up a little bit, it may go down a little bit. That's this set point. That's the ideal value for whatever variable you're looking at. In this case, we're looking at body temperature. Now, one way for homeostasis to control this is something called a negative feedback loop. And I'll show you kind of how that works. But the idea is for homeostasis, you're trying to stay right within this set point. You're trying to stay as close to the set point as possible. That's equilibrium. So if you start getting a little bit above where your temperature should be, you should have physiological changes in place to try to get your body temperature back down close to the set point. And also, if it starts going down a little bit further than it should be, away from the set point, you should have physiological things that take place in the body that tries to get your set point back up, or tries to get your temperature back up close to that set point area. Take a look at this diagram on negative feedback. And so you have 5 major parts to a negative feedback, what's called a feedback loop. Right? You have a stimulus, you have a receptor, you have a control center, an effector, and a response. So in this case, we're looking at a scenario, a negative feedback loop on blood pressure. Right? This is talking about blood pressure. Think back to what your blood pressure, many of you may already know what your blood pressure ideally should be. Your normal type blood pressure is usually 120/80 is kind of your normal set. Usually now they say it should be a little bit less than that, but that's still kind of what you see quoted as a normal blood pressure is 120/80. And so that's a set point. And so a stimulus would be something that would cause some change in that, in that blood pressure. So stimulus would cause some change in it. Receptor is what's receiving or what's monitoring that information. So for example, for blood pressure, you have special receptors that are located here in this aortic arch, here in this vessel. You have special receptors that are detecting and monitoring your blood pressure. Let's say something happens and you go out of homeostasis a little bit, right? That stimulus, maybe your blood pressure is starting to go up a little bit. It's getting a little higher than it should. So the receptors receive that information. It sends that information through the nervous system over to the brain. And the brain many times functions as a control center. It receives information, it processes that information, and then it sends some type of information back somewhere to try to fix the problem. And so it sent, in this scenario, it sent information over about your blood pressure, maybe starting to go up a little bit. And so it sends it over to the brain, and the brain decides what to do. It's the control center. It sends information back to the effector The effector is going to be whatever organ is in place that can make some kind of difference. In this case, it happens to be the heart. Doesn't always have to be the heart, but in this case, the effector is the heart, so it sends information to the heart, and it tells it to do something to change it. If the blood pressure is too high, then it's going to send a signal back to the heart to tell the heart to slow down a little bit, and that'll help allow the blood pressure to go down a little bit. So by sending the information back to the effector, then it will hopefully create a response, and the response is hopefully going to get you back closer to homeostasis. So one way to think about negative feedback is this: it resists the deviation from the set point. You're trying to limit how far away from the set point you actually go. So you try to get back to homeostasis. And so I have those definitions out here for you. The stimulus is whatever's causing the deviation from the set point. The receptor is trying to receive and monitor that value, whether it's blood pressure or temperature or whatever. The control center is what's establishing the set point and what is trying to make decisions about how to fix it if it goes out of the normal values. Most of the time, you'll see the control center as the brain. The effector is whatever organ is in place that can change the value of the variable. In this case, our effector organ was the heart. And then response, whatever the effector does to respond to the control center's information. In this case, the heart is able to, slow down a little bit if the blood pressure is too high, or speed up a little bit if the blood pressure is too low. You can also have a positive feedback mechanism, and this is a little different. In this case, if you have a deviation from the set point, if your set point is, if you start moving away from the set point in either direction, what a positive feedback will do is create an even greater deviation. Right? It doesn't try to get you back to homeostasis. It actually goes a little bit further away from homeostasis. So, for example, there's an example of stretching stimulus during childbirth. The idea is that as a child is being born, going through the process of birthing a child, the child starts to enter into the birth canal. It starts to push on that muscle called the uterus. When that's a smooth muscle, when that smooth muscle detects a stretch, a push in motion, that uterus has a tendency to contract. When it contracts, it opens up the cervical region, it opens up the cervix a little bit, and allows the baby to push further into the birth canal. Well, when it pushes further into the birth canal, then it causes the uterus to contract or to stretch a little bit more. So you have a positive feedback loop. You're not getting closer to homeostasis in this case, you're actually getting further away. But it's a loop that repeats itself until the baby is delivered. Another example here is extreme blood loss. Let's say something happens and you're losing lots of blood. And so one thing that's going to happen is the blood pressure is going to drop because you've lost a lot of blood. Well, if the blood pressure drops, you're not sending as much blood to the heart. If the heart doesn't receive the blood, then that means the heart is only going to be able to pump so much, and so it's going to be pumping less blood. Well, if the heart pumps less blood, that means the blood pressure drops even more, and you kind of see the cycle is going to continue. So that's a positive feedback loop, although notice that you have a bad outcome for this. Positive doesn't mean good in this case. Positive just means that it's going past, it's not getting closer to homeostasis, it's getting further away. Let's look at number 2, complementarity of structure and function. What this means is structure complements function. Structure is such that it best suits its function. So let's take a look at the example. This can be summarized saying form follows function. All right, so take a look at the example. This is an example from the respiratory system. Here you've seen the torso model. We got a set of lungs. They take a little section of the lungs, they expand it, and so now you're looking at an enlarged area of the lungs. This is where gas exchange takes place. When you take a deep breath, take in some gas, you're breathing out all this oxygen, goes inside of the lung cavity here. This would actually be inside of the air sac inside of your lung. That oxygen has to diffuse across the cells that are located here. These are cells. You got a one layer of cell on the inside and one layer of cell here. And so that's going to diffuse this gas, oxygen, across to get into your blood vessel that's here. And then the carbon dioxide gas that you want to get rid of that's inside the blood vessel, it can diffuse very easily across into the air sac. That's how gas exchange should take place. Notice that if the structure was different, it would cause the function not to work. So this structure on the left, this structure complements the function. This structure does not on the right. Because if the tissue of the air sac was too thick, if it was not just one layer of cells, what if it's 5 or 10 layers of cells? Then notice the gases can't go across that thick layer of cells. So this on the right side, this structure does not complement its function. And so usually what you find in the body is that structures complement the function. They go together. Another core principle is gradient. And this goes back to homeostasis as well. Gradients present at any time where you have more of something on one side of a barrier than on the other. That's a gradient. You've got more of something on one side than you have on the other side. And so there's many different examples of gradient. They give you some examples down here at the bottom in your textbook as well. You could have a temperature gradient. So the closer you are to the heater, you have hotter temperatures. And then as you go further away, the temperature goes down. So there's a gradient, a change, a gradual change in the temperature, higher on one side, and then as you go further away, it's a gradient, it gets lower. So you have a gradient of temperature. You can have a concentration gradient. And so what they've done in this little example, they got a beaker of water maybe. They put some kind of pill or tablet in there to dissolve. And so right around this area, it's going to be higher concentration. But notice as you get closer, further away, as you get further away from the pill, then you see that the concentration of the pill goes down. And so that's a concentration gradient. You can also have a pressure gradient. Generally, things want to move from high pressure to low pressure. Fluids move that way, gases move that way. And so in this case, a high pressure inside the syringe. You got a little picture of a little syringe there. And so by pushing and creating high pressure, you have higher pressure out inside here as you're pushing on the syringe, high pressure inside, low pressure outside. That creates a pressure gradient. In other words, that creates pressure that would push the air out to the area from high pressure to low pressure. So there's lots of different processes that we'll eventually talk about that are driven by some type of pressure or concentration or temperature gradient. Cell-to-cell communication, this is just another principle that we'll talk about throughout, not just this chapter, but throughout the course. Your body functions basically rely on cell-to-cell communication. Cells really communicate with each other. Usually it's through some type of chemical. And you'll see this more when you get to the endocrine system, because that's what endocrine a lot is about, is producing chemicals. They're called chemical messengers. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we'll also mainly talk about electrical signals that's transmitting information from one cell to another cell. Now that's all for this particular chapter. This is just a summary, and make sure you go back and read over the chapter. We'll be covering more information from chapter 1 in our lab time.